sat in the dimly lit corner of the Military Rehabilitation Center, his 4 arms trembling despite the medication flowing through his system. The other veterans gave him space now, understanding that some wounds never healed, some memories never faded. For 3 cycles, he had maintained his silence about what happened on Terran Front 7. For 3 cycles, he had let the Galactic Military Council believe their sanitized reports about unexpected human tactical adaptations and unconventional warfare methods. Today, that silence would end. The recorder sat before him on the metal table, its blue light pulsing gently, waiting. Doctor, the therapist assigned to his case, watched him with those large, compassionate eyes that had seen too many broken soldiers. She didn't push, didn't demand. She simply waited as she had for months, knowing that eventually the dam would break. "They want to know about the humans," finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "The council, the strategists, the generals who send young soldiers to die. They want to understand why we lost 70% of our forces in what should have been a simple pacification mission." His main right hand reached for the water container, but stopped halfway, the tremor too visible, too shameful. Doctor made no comment, merely pushed the container closer within his reach. "I was a senior battle coordinator for the 47th Hegemony Strike Force," he continued. 27 successful campaigns across 19 systems. I had seen the death cults fight to the last spawn. I had watched the queens sacrifice entire hives for tactical advantage. I thought I understood warfare, understood what desperation could drive a species to do. He laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the sterile walls. "The humans taught me that I understood nothing." His memories pulled him back to the briefing room aboard the dreadnought Eternal Dominance, 3 cycles and a lifetime ago. The holographic display showed a blue-green world, 3rd planet from a yellow star, designated Terra by its inhabitants. The intelligence reports painted a picture of a young species, barely 200,000 years evolved, possessing primitive chemical-based weapons and crude space travel capabilities. "The humans had been observed for approximately 50 standard years," he told Doctor. "Our classified them as aggressive but disorganized. Their inability to unify even their single home world was seen as evidence of their primitive nature. They fought among themselves constantly, over resources, territory, ideology. The military council concluded they would be easily subjugated. The plan had been textbook standard. Establish orbital superiority, neutralize major population centers, force capitulation through overwhelming display of technological advantage. The humans had no energy weapons, no shielding technology, no faster-than-light capability beyond the most rudimentary systems gifted to them by early contact protocols. On paper, it should have been over in days. We arrived in system during what the humans call their winter season, in the northern hemisphere of their primary continent. Our fleet consisted of 12 heavy cruisers, 48 destroyers, and supporting craft. Total force, approximately 200,000 hegemony troops from 7 different species. The humans had perhaps 50 of their crewed spacecraft in orbit, primitive metal shells with chemical propulsion. Paused, reaching again for the water. This time he managed to grasp it, though his hands still shook. The first sign something was wrong came during initial orbital bombardment. Standard doctrine called for targeted strikes on military installations and government centers. We expected panic, surrender broadcasts, desperate pleas for mercy. Instead, we received a single transmission on all frequencies. He could still hear it, that calm human voice speaking in their harsh, angular language, translated instantly by their systems. "This is Admiral Sarah, United Earth Defense Command. You have fired upon civilian and military targets without provocation or declaration of war. As of this moment, a state of war exists between Earth and your forces. We suggest you leave." That was all. No threats, no blustering, no demands for negotiation, just a simple statement of fact. My commander, Fleet Marshal, was amused. She ordered the bombardment to continue. The next 12 hours had been routine. Orbital strikes eliminated major military installations, communication hubs, power generation facilities. Human spacecraft that approached were easily destroyed or disabled. Reconnaissance showed the expected civilian evacuations from major population centers, mass panic, breakdown of social order. Everything proceeded according to plan. We began landing operations at dawn local time over their primary continent. Initial drops targeted major urban centers: New York, London, Berlin, Tokyo, Beijing. Each site received a full battle group, roughly 5,000 troops with heavy armor and air support. The humans had scattered ground forces, but they appeared to be in retreat. We encountered minimal resistance in the first phase. His voice grew quieter, more strained. I was with the force that landed outside the city they called Chicago. It was beautiful in its way. Primitive, certainly, but there was something about these human cities, these towering structures reaching toward the sky, that spoke of ambition, of dreams larger than their capabilities. I remember thinking it was almost tragic that such creativity would have to be suppressed. The urban combat began on the second day. Human military forces had regrouped faster than anticipated, launching coordinated attacks on hegemony positions. But these weren't the desperate last stands they had expected. The humans fought with a cold, calculated efficiency that caught the hegemony forces off guard. They knew we were technologically superior. They had observed our weapons, our tactics, our capabilities. But instead of despairing, they adapted. In real time, Doctor, while battle raged around them, human commanders were rewriting doctrine, inventing new strategies, finding ways to turn our advantages against us. The first real shock came when human forces began using their own infrastructure as weapons. Buildings were rigged to collapse at precise moments, creating defensive positions and trapping hegemony vehicles. Underground transportation networks became hidden movement corridors, allowing human forces to appear and disappear seemingly at will. Sewage systems were flooded with chemical irritants that could penetrate basic environmental suits. But that was just the beginning. The humans started targeting our logistics in ways that conventional military thinking. They didn't just attack supply convoys, they poisoned them. Food supplies were contaminated with compounds that wouldn't kill immediately, but would incapacitate troops hours or days later. Equipment was sabotaged with microscopic modifications that would cause critical failures at the worst possible moments. Stood and walked to the small window, looking out at the peaceful gardens of the rehabilitation center. We were fighting an enemy that learned from every engagement, that shared information instantly across their entire force structure. Each time we adapted to their tactics, they had already moved on to something new. The breaking point for his understanding of warfare came on the 5th day of the operation. His battle group had been tasked with securing a human medical facility, a large complex that intelligence suggested was being used as a command center. The mission should have been straightforward: secure the facility, process any human personnel for interrogation, establish a forward operating base. We approached at dawn, full tactical formation. Scouts had reported minimal human presence, perhaps 50 individuals, mostly medical staff. We had 300 troops, armor support, air cover. It should have been over in minutes. Instead, they walked into hell. The humans had turned the entire complex into a trap. Not just the building, the surrounding area, the approach routes, even the airspace above. They had studied our tactics, our formation protocols, our standard procedures, and designed a killing ground specifically for us. The assault began normally. Advance units moved toward the main building while support teams secured the perimeter. The first indication of trouble came when the lead squad simply vanished. No explosion, no weapon discharge, no communication. One moment they were advancing across the courtyard, the next moment they were gone. We found them later, underground. The humans had excavated a tunnel network beneath the entire facility. Our troops had stepped through concealed openings into a maze of passages where human forces waited with close-quarters weapons. But that wasn't the worst part. Turned back to Doctor, his eyes haunted. The humans had studied our psychology, our fears, our weaknesses as thoroughly as they had studied our tactics. They knew exactly how to break us mentally as well as physically. The underground tunnels were filled with horrors designed specifically to terrorize hegemony troops. Recordings of wounded soldier communications played on loop. Holographic projections created false walls and passages, leading troops into kill zones or simply causing them to become hopelessly lost. Psychological warfare techniques that the hegemony had never imagined were employed with surgical precision. Above ground, the nightmare continued. The humans had rigged every room, every corridor, every piece of equipment with improvised weapons. Medical scanners became explosive devices. Surgical tools were converted into projectile weapons. Even the beds were trapped approach 1, and hidden mechanisms would fire sedatives designed specifically for our physiology. The human medical staff weren't passive victims waiting for rescue. They were active participants in the defense, using their knowledge of anatomy and chemistry to create weapons and tactics that exploited specific vulnerabilities in hegemony biology. Aerosol dispersers filled rooms with compounds that caused temporary blindness in troops. Ultrasonic generators produced frequencies that induced panic responses in soldiers. We called for reinforcements, for orbital bombardment, for anything that could help us escape that accursed place. But the humans had prepared for that too. They had communications jammers that selectively blocked our frequencies while leaving theirs intact. They had anti-air weapons positioned to target our evacuation craft. They had even prepared false surrender signals to lure our rescue teams into additional traps. By the end of the first day inside the medical complex, this battle group had suffered 60% casualties without achieving any of their objectives. The humans continued to control most of the facility, continued to coordinate their defense with cold efficiency, continued to adapt to every tactical change the hegemony forces attempted. But the truly terrifying part, Doctor, was not their weapons or their tactics or even their traps. It was their faces. When we finally encountered human defenders in direct combat, when we looked into their eyes as they fought, there was no fear, no desperation, no anger even, just cold, calculating determination. They fought like machines, but machines with creativity, with intelligence, with the ability to think beyond any programming. The second day brought new horrors. Human forces began using captured hegemony equipment, not just as weapons, but as psychological tools. Captured communication devices broadcast false orders, sowing confusion among remaining hegemony troops. Stolen medical supplies were used to treat human wounded, while hegemony casualties received tainted versions that caused additional suffering without killing immediately. They studied us, Doctor, while we fought for our lives in that nightmare complex. They studied us. They learned our organizational structure from captured communications. They identified our leaders from behavioral patterns. They analyzed our equipment and developed countermeasures in real time. The humans even turned the facility's original purpose against them. Medical knowledge became a weapon, as human defenders demonstrated intimate understanding of hegemony physiology. They knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum incapacitation without immediate death, ensuring that wounded troops became burdens that slowed down their healthy comrades. They understood which injuries would cause the most psychological impact on specific species within the hegemony forces. By the third day, my troops were refusing orders, not from cowardice. These were veteran soldiers who had fought in dozens of campaigns. They were refusing because they recognized that the humans were not just trying to win a battle. They were studying us, learning from us, preparing for a larger war that we were only beginning to understand. The final blow to this understanding came when human forces began demonstrating technological capabilities that contradicted all intelligence reports. Improvised energy weapons appeared, cobbled together from medical equipment and industrial materials. Makeshift shields that could deflect hegemony plasma fire emerged from what had been simple metal plating. Communication devices that shouldn't have existed began coordinating complex multidimensional tactics. We realized that the humans had been deliberately concealing their true capabilities during the observation period. Everything we thought we knew about their technology, their organization, their potential was either incomplete or deliberately false. They had been preparing for this war long before our fleets arrived in their system. Returned to his chair, exhausted by the memories. On the fourth day, I requested permission to withdraw from the medical facility. The request was, Fleet Marshal ordered us to complete the mission regardless of casualties. She still believed this was a simple pacification operation that had encountered unexpected local resistance. But his troops knew better. They had seen enough to understand that they were facing something unprecedented in galactic military history. A species that could match the hegemony's technological advantages through pure adaptability and ruthless creativity. The humans weren't just defending their world. They were learning to destroy their enemies more effectively than any military force the galaxy had ever seen. That night, as we huddled in whatever defensible positions we could establish within the facility, my communications officer intercepted human transmissions. Their language was being translated automatically by our systems, so we could understand their tactical discussions. What they heard changed everything. The human forces weren't just defending the medical facility. They were treating it as a laboratory. Every hegemony tactic, every weapon, every piece of equipment was being analyzed and Human scientists and military engineers were working around the clock to develop countermeasures, improvements, and innovations based on captured hegemony technology. They weren't fighting to win a battle, Doctor. They were fighting to win the war. Every engagement was a learning experience. Every captured weapon was reverse engineered. Every tactical innovation was immediately shared across their entire global defense network. The recordings also revealed the scope of human preparation. Underground facilities across their planet were manufacturing weapons and equipment using hybrid human hegemony technology. Training centers were producing soldiers who had been taught to fight specifically against hegemony forces, using detailed intelligence gathered during the observation period. Research laboratories were developing new weapons and defenses based on stolen hegemony designs. We had walked into a trap that encompassed their entire planet. Every engagement, every battle, every small victory we thought we had achieved was part of a larger human strategy to learn our capabilities and develop superior countermeasures. As finished recounting the fourth day, Doctor leaned forward slightly. What happened next? How did you escape the medical facility? His laugh was hollow, bitter. Escape? We didn't escape, Doctor. The humans let us go. On the fifth day, human forces simply. They dismantled their positions, collected their equipment, and disappeared. The facility was left empty except for a single human medical officer who formally surrendered himself for processing. Why? Because they had learned everything they needed to know. Our tactics, our weapons, our psychology, our weaknesses. The medical facility had served its purpose as a training ground and research laboratory. They had no further use for it or for us. The reality was even worse than that simple explanation. As hegemony forces evacuated the facility, they discovered that every engagement had been recorded by hidden human surveillance devices. Every conversation, every tactical decision, every moment of fear or confusion had been captured and transmitted to human military analysts. The entire battle had been a performance for an audience that was taking detailed notes on how to destroy them more efficiently. The human officer who surrendered carried a message for Fleet Marshal. It was quite simple. Thank you for the education. Class dismissed. Doctor made a note on her data pad. This was just one engagement, though. What about the overall campaign? Stared at the wall, seeing not the peaceful colors of the rehabilitation center, but the burning skis above Terra. The overall campaign, Doctor, was when we learned that the medical facility was not an exception. It was the rule. Every human position, every city, every defensive installation had been turned into a laboratory for learning how to kill us more effectively. The session had run longer than usual, but Doctor knew they were finally making progress. For months, had refused to discuss the details of the Terra campaign. Today, he had barely begun to scratch the surface of what had happened during those terrifying days, but it was a start. We'll continue tomorrow, she said gently. You've done well today. As the recording device powered down and Doctor gathered her materials, remained seated, staring out the window at the peaceful gardens. But he wasn't seeing the carefully manicured lawns and flowering plants. He was seeing the face of that last human medical officer, calm and professional as he handed over intelligence that would help his species destroy the most powerful military force in the galaxy. Doctor, he called out as she reached the door. Yes. The Council. They still don't understand, do they? They think this was just an unusually difficult pacification operation. Doctor paused, considering her words carefully. The official reports suggest that human resistance was more organized than anticipated. Nodded slowly. Tomorrow I'll tell you about what happened in their cities, about how they turned urban warfare into art, about how they made us afraid of shadows and silence. As the door closed behind Doctor, continued to stare out the window, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in memories of burning cities where humans had demonstrated that they didn't just fight wars, they revolutionized them. Tomorrow, he would begin explaining how a supposedly primitive species had taken everything the galaxy thought it knew about warfare and turned it inside out. The first day of testimony was over, but knew that the worst revelations were yet to come. The medical facility had been their introduction to human warfare. The cities had been their education in human horror. Doctor arrived early to the rehabilitation center the next morning, finding already seated in their usual corner, staring at the dormant recording device. He hadn't slept. She could tell from the way his secondary arms hung limp at his sides and the dull sheen in his compound eyes. Veterans often experienced this pattern when breakthrough sessions triggered deeper memories. "Are you ready to continue?" she asked gently, settling into her chair across from him. His response was immediate, as if he had been rehearsing the words all night. After the medical facility, Fleet Marshal reassigned our forces to urban pacification operations. She believed that what happened at the medical complex was an anomaly, a specially prepared trap that didn't represent human capabilities in general. He reached out and activated the recording device himself this time, the blue light casting shadows across his face. She was wrong. The medical facility wasn't special preparation. It was standard human doctrine. The reassignment came with reinforcements and new equipment. The losses at the medical facility had been explained as the result of inadequate intelligence rather than superior human tactics. Fresh troops arrived with enhanced armor, better weapons, and updated communication systems designed to counter the jamming techniques humans had employed. I was given command of a mixed battalion tasked with securing the human city designated as Berlin in their European sector. Intelligence reported a population of approximately 3.5 million humans, with significant industrial infrastructure that could be converted to support hegemony operations. The mission parameters were standard urban pacification, neutralize defensive positions, establish control zones, process civilian populations for relocation. The approach to Berlin should have been routine. Orbital reconnaissance showed evacuated city centers, abandoned defensive positions, and scattered human forces retreating toward the outskirts. The massive urban area appeared to be following the same pattern as other cities across the planet's civilian evacuation, followed by token military resistance before inevitable surrender. We entered the city at dawn through multiple approach vectors. I commanded the Northern Force, approximately 2,000 troops with full armor support. The plan called for systematic advance through the urban grid, establishing secure zones and eliminating any remaining resistance. Standard doctrine that had worked successfully on dozens of worlds. But Berlin was not like other worlds. As forces moved through the outer districts, they encountered their first indication that human urban warfare was fundamentally different from anything in hegemony experience. The buildings themselves had been weaponized. Every structure we entered was a potential death trap, but not in the crude way you might expect. The humans had studied our standard urban combat procedures and redesigned their entire city to counter them. Doorways were narrowed to force our troops into single-file formation where they could be targeted individually. Stairwells were modified to create with overlapping fields of fire. Even the windows were positioned to provide perfect sniper positions, while offering no clear lines of sight for our return fire. The modifications weren't random vandalism or desperate improvisation. They represented a complete understanding of hegemony urban combat doctrine combined with innovative engineering solutions. Humans had rebuilt sections of their own city specifically to kill invading forces more efficiently. But the physical modifications were only the beginning. The humans had turned the entire urban environment into an interconnected weapons system. Underground tunnels connected buildings in ways that allowed defenders to appear behind our lines without warning. Sewer systems had been converted into rapid transportation networks. Even the electrical grid had been weaponized. Power lines could deliver lethal charges to anyone wearing metal armor who came into contact with them. The first day of urban combat resulted in casualties that shocked even, despite his experience at the medical facility. Human forces didn't defend fixed positions in the traditional sense. Instead, they flowed through the urban environment like water, appearing where they were needed, striking with precise efficiency, then vanishing before hegemony forces could respond. They fought like the city itself was alive and thinking. Buildings that appeared empty would suddenly produce dozens of defenders. Structures we had cleared and secured would somehow become occupied again hours later. It was as if the humans could reshape reality itself to suit their tactical needs. The psychological impact on hegemony troops was severe. Soldiers who had fought successfully against conventional enemies found themselves paralyzed by an environment where anything could be a threat, where safety was always temporary, where the battlefield itself seemed to be actively working against them. My communications officer, a veteran with 15 years of combat experience, suffered a complete breakdown on the second day. He started claiming that the city was watching us, that the buildings had eyes, that human voices were coming from inside the walls. I initially attributed this to combat stress, But as the operation continued, I began to understand what he meant. The humans had installed monitoring systems throughout the urban environment that were far more sophisticated than anything in hegemony intelligence reports. Every movement, every communication, every tactical decision was being observed and analyzed in real time. Human forces knew where hegemony troops were located at all times, knew what they were planning, knew their psychological state and physical condition. We were fighting an enemy that possessed perfect intelligence about our forces while remaining completely invisible to us. They knew when we were tired, when our morale was low, when our equipment needed maintenance, when our commanders were making poor decisions. They used this knowledge to time their attacks for maximum psychological impact. The human understanding of hegemony psychology went beyond simple observation. They had developed specific tactics designed to exploit known weaknesses in different species. Troops were subjected to high-frequency sounds that induced anxiety. Soldiers encountered darkness patterns that triggered claustrophobic responses. Each species within its mixed battalion faced customized psychological warfare designed specifically for their mental vulnerabilities. On the third day, we encountered human forces using captured hegemony equipment, but they had modified it in ways that demonstrated complete understanding of our technology. Our own plasma rifles were being used against us, but with improved focusing crystals that increased their range and power. Our armor was being worn by human soldiers who had somehow adapted it to fit their different physiology. More disturbing was the evidence that humans were not just copying hegemony technology, but improving it. Captured vehicles showed modifications that enhanced speed and maneuverability. Communication devices had been upgraded with better encryption and longer range. Even basic equipment like body armor had been redesigned to provide better protection while remaining lighter and more flexible. The humans weren't just learning to use our technology, they were making it better. In the space of days, they had identified flaws and limitations that hegemony engineers had never noticed, then developed solutions that exceeded original specifications. The tactical innovations were equally impressive and terrifying. Human forces introduced new combat doctrines that combined their natural creativity with captured hegemony capabilities. Traditional human military units were integrated with enhanced technology teams that could adapt to changing battlefield conditions in real time. They created hybrid tactics that no military academy in the galaxy had ever contemplated. Human creativity, combined with hegemony technology, produced warfare concepts that were simultaneously familiar and completely alien. We were fighting an enemy that understood us better than we understood ourselves, using our own weapons in ways we had never imagined. Doctor made a note on her data pad. How did your forces respond to these developments? Surely hegemony military doctrine included procedures for dealing with technologically adaptive enemies. His bitter laugh echoed off the walls. Our doctrine assumed that technological adaptation would take months or years, not hours. We had procedures for dealing with enemies who reverse-engineered captured equipment after extended research periods. We had no procedures for dealing with enemies who could analyze, improve, and deploy our own technology faster than we could adapt to their usage of it. The fourth day of urban combat brought new horrors as human forces began demonstrating technological capabilities that seemed to violate known scientific principles. Energy weapons appeared that operated on unfamiliar principles, creating effects that hegemony armor was not designed to resist. Defensive systems emerged that could neutralize hegemony weapons through unknown mechanisms. We began to suspect that human technological capability had been deliberately concealed during the observation period. Either their science was far more advanced than intelligence had reported, or they possessed an ability to accelerate technological development that exceeded anything known to galactic civilization. The evidence suggested both possibilities were true. Hidden human research facilities were producing advanced technology at unprecedented rates, while captured hegemony equipment provided blueprints for innovations that surpassed original capabilities. Human scientists were not just copying hegemony technology. They were using it as a foundation for developments that the hegemony itself had never achieved. But the technology was not the worst part, Doctor. The worst part was how they used it. Human forces demonstrated a level of tactical coordination that exceeded anything in hegemony military history. They fought as if every soldier was connected to every other soldier by direct neural link, sharing information and coordinating actions with impossible precision. The human command structure appeared to operate without the hierarchical limitations that characterized hegemony forces. Information flowed instantly from the lowest-level soldier to the highest-level commander, and back again. Tactical decisions were made and implemented with a speed that left hegemony forces constantly reacting to developments they couldn't predict or counter. Individual human soldiers demonstrated decision-making capabilities that would have required consultation with multiple levels of command in our forces. They adapted to changing situations with an independence and creativity that made our rigid command structure seem primitive by comparison. The fifth day of urban combat brought the first signs that hegemony forces were beginning to break psychologically as well as tactically. Veteran soldiers were refusing direct orders, claiming that human forces possessed supernatural abilities that made resistance futile. Equipment failures were blamed on human sabotage, even when no human forces were present. Paranoia and fear were spreading through the ranks faster than any disease. I began receiving reports that human voices could be heard inside our secured positions, speaking in languages that our translation systems couldn't process. Soldiers claimed that humans were appearing and disappearing without using doors or other conventional entrances. Equipment would malfunction in ways that seemed designed to cause maximum psychological impact rather than simple failure. Investigation revealed that humans were using advanced psychological warfare techniques combined with technologies that hegemony forces couldn't understand or counter. Hidden speakers created audio illusions that made voices seem to come from impossible locations. Holographic projectors created visual phantoms that appeared solid until touched. Even the air itself seemed to carry chemical agents that induced specific emotional responses. The humans had weaponized reality itself, Doctor. They had turned their entire city into a machine designed to destroy not just our bodies, but our minds. Every sight, every sound, every sensation was calculated to reduce our effectiveness and increase our fear. The psychological warfare was supported by intelligence operations that penetrated hegemony security with ease. Humans seemed to know the personal histories, family connections, and psychological profiles of individual hegemony soldiers. They used this information to create personalized psychological attacks that targeted specific individuals with devastating precision. On the sixth day, my personal aide received a message from human forces that included detailed information about his family on the information that should have been classified at the highest levels of hegemony security. The message was not a threat, but a simple statement of knowledge, designed to demonstrate that human intelligence capabilities extended far beyond our battlefield. Similar incidents occurred throughout forces. Soldiers received personalized messages that demonstrated intimate knowledge of their backgrounds, their fears, their relationships, their secrets. The messages weren't threatening. They were simply proof that human intelligence operations had penetrated every aspect of hegemony society and military structure. We realized that the war was not confined to their planet or even their star system. Human intelligence operations were active throughout hegemony space, gathering information, preparing assets, positioning resources for a conflict that they had been planning long before our fleets arrived. The scope of human preparation became clear as more evidence emerged. Communication intercepts revealed human agents operating on hegemony worlds, human technology hidden in hegemony facilities, human influence networks that extended into the highest levels of galactic government and military command. The observation period had not been one-sided. Humans had been studying the entire hegemony civilization with the same thoroughness that hegemony scouts had studied Earth. But even more terrifying than the scope of their intelligence operations was the evidence of their long-term strategic thinking. Humans had not just prepared for this war, they had prepared for the next war and the war after that. They were fighting battles that hadn't started yet, against enemies they hadn't met yet, using weapons they hadn't finished building yet. Doctor looked up from her notes. What do you mean by that? How could they prepare for unknown future conflicts? Stood and walked to the window again, but his movements were more controlled now, as if the act of finally speaking about these experiences was providing some relief from the psychological burden he had carried. Human strategic doctrine operates on time scales that exceed normal military planning. They weren't just preparing to defend their world. They were preparing to expand into galactic civilization as conquerors. Every engagement with our forces was being analyzed not just for tactical advantages in the current war, but for strategic advantages in future wars against enemies they had never encountered. The evidence was overwhelming once patterns became clear. Human research facilities were developing weapons and technologies designed to counter threats that didn't currently exist. Training programs were preparing soldiers for combat environments they had never seen. Intelligence operations were gathering information about galactic civilizations they had no current contact with. They were preparing to replace the hegemony as the dominant military force in the galaxy. Doctor. The war on there was just the beginning of a campaign that would eventually encompass every inhabited system known to galactic civilization. The realization had struck on the 7th day of urban combat, as his forces huddled in whatever defensible positions they could establish in a city that had become a living nightmare. Human forces weren't just defending their world. They were demonstrating capabilities designed to intimidate any other potential enemies who might be observing the conflict. Every innovation, every tactical development, every technological breakthrough was being broadcast on frequencies that would reach every major civilization in the galaxy. The humans wanted other species to see what they could do, wanted potential enemies to understand the consequences of challenging human expansion. The broadcasts weren't crude propaganda, but sophisticated psychological warfare operations designed to demoralize potential enemies before conflicts even began. Human military capabilities were being displayed with calculated precision, showing just enough to inspire fear while concealing enough to maintain operational advantages. We were not just soldiers in a pacification operation, Doctor. We were unwilling actors in a demonstration designed to establish human dominance over galactic civilization. Every casualty, every tactical failure, every moment of terror was being recorded and broadcast as proof of human military superiority. The session was again running long, but Doctor could see that needed to continue. The memories were flowing now like water through a broken dam, and interrupting the process might cause him to retreat back into silence. What finally happened in Berlin? How did the urban combat operation end? Turned back from the window, his eyes focusing on something far beyond the peaceful rehabilitation center gardens. It ended the same way the medical facility ended, Doctor. The humans simply left. After 7 days of combat that had reduced my forces to less than 30% operational strength, human forces from the city overnight. We woke up on the 8th day to find Berlin empty except for a single human representative. Another surrender. No, this time, it was a human military officer who came to inform us that our presence was no longer required. The city had served its purpose as a testing ground for urban warfare techniques. Human forces had gathered all the data they needed about hegemony capabilities and weaknesses. We were free to go. The dismissal had been polite, professional, and utterly devastating to hegemony morale. After a week of combat that had claimed thousands of lives and destroyed millions of credits worth of military equipment, human forces were simply finished with their experiment. The battle had meant everything to hegemony forces and nothing to human strategic objectives. The human officer provided us with detailed medical assessments of our remaining troops, including treatment recommendations for psychological trauma that hadn't been officially diagnosed yet. They knew the condition of our forces better than our own medical staff knew. The medical assessments included personal psychological profiles that demonstrated human understanding of individual hegemony soldiers at a level that should have required years of observation and analysis. Human intelligence operations had not just penetrated hegemony security, they had achieved complete psychological transparency of enemy forces. As we evacuated Berlin, human forces provided us with gifts, improved versions of our own equipment that had been modified during the week of combat. Our communication devices had been upgraded with better encryption and longer range. Our medical supplies had been enhanced with improved effectiveness. Our weapons had been modified for better accuracy and reliability. The gifts were not gestures of friendship, but demonstrations of technological superiority. Humans were not just returning captured equipment, they were returning improved equipment that exceeded hegemony specifications. The message was clear. Human technology could enhance anything the hegemony could produce. That night, as we lifted off from Berlin, I realized that everything we thought we knew about warfare, about technology, about the nature of intelligence itself, had become obsolete. The humans had not just defeated us militarily, they had evolved beyond us as a species. Doctor made final notes as the recording device powered down. Tomorrow, we'll discuss what happened after Berlin, how the campaign developed from that point. Nodded slowly. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about the night raids, Doctor, about how humans turned darkness itself into a weapon, about how they made us afraid to sleep, afraid to dream, afraid to exist. As Doctor gathered her materials and left the room, remained by the window, watching the sun set over the rehabilitation center gardens. But in his mind, he was seeing different skis, darker skis, skis filled with human aircraft that moved like ghosts through the night, carrying warriors who had transformed terror into an art form. The worst revelations were still to come. Was already seated when Doctor arrived, but something had changed overnight. His posture was different, more rigid, more controlled, as if he was preparing himself for an ordeal. The recording device sat between them like an active weapon, its dormant state somehow more ominous than its operational blue glow. The night raids began 3 days after Berlin, he said without preamble, activating the recorder with a gesture that had become automatic. Fleet Marshal had declared the urban operations a success, despite our casualty reports. Her official assessment was that human resistance was decreasing and final pacification was imminent. Doctor settled into her chair, nodding the way. Secondary arms were pressed tightly against his sides, a defensive posture she had seen in trauma patients before. What made the night raids different from the urban combat? His compound eyes reflected the recording device's blue light like fractured mirrors. The urban combat had rules, Doctor, boundaries. The humans fought according to recognizable military doctrine, even when they were adapting it beyond our understanding. The night raids had no rules, no boundaries, no limits that we could comprehend. After the withdrawal from Berlin, hegemony forces had been consolidated into fortified positions outside major human population centers. The strategy was simple: establish secure bases with overlapping fields of fire, maintain constant surveillance, and prevent human forces from regrouping. Standard siege warfare that had proven effective on dozens of worlds. Our base outside Munich was considered the most secure position in the European sector. We had 15,000 troops, complete air superiority, orbital fire support, and defensive positions that could withstand direct assault by conventional forces. The perimeter was monitored by automated systems that could detect movement at ranges exceeding 10 kilometers. Nothing should have been able to approach undetected. The first night raid came without warning on the 4th night after establishing the base. Had been reviewing casualty reports when the perimeter alarms began sounding. Not the steady tone that indicated detected movement, but the chaotic wail that meant the surveillance systems themselves were malfunctioning. The alarm lasted exactly 17 seconds. Then silence, complete silence. Every automated system, every communication device, every piece of electronic equipment in the base stopped functioning simultaneously. We were blind, deaf, and defenseless in the space of 17 seconds. But the equipment failure was only the beginning. As hegemony forces struggled to understand what had happened to their technology, they began to notice other changes in their environment. The air felt different, thicker, somehow charged with an energy that made their skin crawl. Shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. Sounds echoed strangely, creating the impression of movement where none should exist. The humans had not just attacked our technology, Doctor, they had attacked reality itself. The base had become wrong, twisted, as if the fundamental laws of physics were being selectively modified to disadvantage our forces. Doctor frowned at her notes. That sounds like advanced psychological warfare rather than actual physics modification. Sensory manipulation, perhaps. His laugh was hollow. That's what I thought initially. Sophisticated illusions, chemical agents, advanced holography, but the effects were measurable, verifiable, impossible to explain through conventional science. Gravity readings fluctuated. Electromagnetic fields shifted randomly. Temperature variations occurred without energy sources. The humans had weaponized physics itself. The first sign of human presence came not through sight or sound, but through scent. A subtle alteration in the air that suggested the presence of something that shouldn't exist, a metallic tang mixed with ozone, and something organic that triggered instinctual fear responses in multiple species simultaneously. Our scouts reported movement in the darkness beyond the perimeter, but their descriptions contradicted each other and logical analysis. Some claimed to see human figures that moved too fast for their equipment to track. Others reported structures that hadn't been there during daylight reconnaissance. All agreed that something was approaching, but none could provide reliable intelligence about what or how many. The psychological impact on hegemony forces was immediate and severe. Veteran soldiers who had faced death in dozens of campaigns found themselves paralyzed by an environment where their training and experience provided no guidance. Equipment they trusted became unreliable. Tactics they understood became useless. Reality itself became an enemy. The humans began their assault not with weapons, but with fear. They moved through the darkness like predators, allowing our forces to catch glimpses of movement that suggested threats without revealing actual capabilities. They were hunting us psychologically before they began hunting us physically. The actual attacks began at what humans called 3 o'clock in the morning, the time when biological rhythms were at their lowest ebb and psychological resistance was weakest. But these weren't conventional military strikes. Human forces seemed to materialize from the darkness itself, appearing inside defensive positions that should have been impenetrable. They came through walls, through solid metal barriers that should have stopped any known infiltration technique. Our security recordings showed human soldiers stepping through matter, as if it were merely an inconvenient suggestion rather than a physical barrier. The recordings, when examined later, revealed impossibilities that challenged fundamental understanding of physics and technology. Human figures appeared to phase in and out of solid matter, moving through obstacles without damaging them or themselves. Advanced analysis suggested sophisticated teleportation technology, but the energy requirements for such capabilities should have been detectable from orbital positions. Either human technology far exceeded our intelligence estimates, or they possessed capabilities that operated according to scientific principles unknown to galactic civilization. Both possibilities were equally terrifying. The human assault techniques combined impossible infiltration capabilities with psychological warfare of unprecedented sophistication. Individual hegemony soldiers would find themselves isolated from their units without understanding how separation had occurred. Communication systems would carry false orders that seemed to originate from legitimate command sources. Equipment would malfunction in ways that created maximum psychological impact while leaving no evidence of sabotage. They didn't just attack our positions, Doctor. They attacked our minds, our sense of reality, our fundamental understanding of what was possible. Soldiers would report engaging human targets that disappeared when reinforcements arrived. Equipment readings would show impossible energy signatures that vanished when technical staff attempted verification. But the most devastating aspect of the human night raids was their selectivity. Human forces demonstrated complete knowledge of hegemony command structures, targeting specific individuals with surgical precision while leaving others untouched. Senior officers would simply vanish from secured positions without triggering any alarms or leaving any evidence of their departure. My second-in-command disappeared on the first night. Commander was in a secured communication bunker, surrounded by guards, monitoring multiple surveillance systems. At 3:47 hours, he stopped responding to communications. Guards entered the bunker to find it empty, with all security systems indicating that no one had entered or left the facility. Investigation revealed that it had not just disappeared. He had been surgically removed from the base's operational structure without disrupting any other systems or personnel. His replacement had been seamlessly integrated into the command hierarchy before his absence was discovered, suggesting human intelligence operations that operated at speeds approaching precognition. The humans weren't just kidnapping our officers, Doctor. They were performing real-time reorganization of our command structure, removing effective leaders and leaving those who would make poor decisions. They were conducting psychological surgery on our entire military organization. The human ability to predict and manipulate hegemony decision-making processes exceeded anything in galactic military experience. They seemed to know what orders would be given before the officers giving them had made their decisions. Countermeasures were neutralized before they were implemented. Tactical innovations were rendered obsolete before they were deployed. By the second night, we realized that human forces possessed intelligence capabilities that bordered on telepathy. They knew our plans, our fears, our weaknesses, our strengths, our individual psychological profiles at a level of detail that should have required years of observation and analysis. The evidence suggested that human intelligence operations had achieved complete psychological transparency of hegemony forces. Every thought, every emotion, every decision was apparently known to human commanders in real time. Privacy, secrecy, and operational security had become obsolete concepts in the face of human intelligence capabilities. But even more terrifying than their intelligence operations was their restraint. Human forces demonstrated the ability to eliminate our entire base at any time, but they chose not to. They were deliberately prolonging our suffering, extending our psychological torment, using us as laboratory subjects for testing new torture techniques. The realization that they were being kept alive for experimental purposes broke the morale of many hegemony troops more effectively than any direct attack could have. Professional soldiers who could face death with courage found themselves unable to cope with the knowledge that they had become subjects in human research programs designed to perfect torture and psychological manipulation techniques. On the third night, human forces began returning kidnapped personnel, but they came back, changed. Commander reappeared in his bunker exactly 72 hours after his disappearance, with no memory of where he had been or what had happened to him. Medical examination revealed no physical alterations, but psychological assessment indicated fundamental changes in his mental patterns. The returned personnel showed evidence of memory modification, personality adjustment, and psychological programming that exceeded any known galactic technology. They retained their basic skills and knowledge, but displayed subtle behavioral changes that made them more compliant, more predictable, more useful to human intelligence operations. The humans had not just kidnapped our officers, Doctor. They had improved them, made them better soldiers, better leaders, better servants of human strategic objectives. They were demonstrating the ability to edit personality itself, to rewrite the basic patterns of consciousness according to their preferences. Doctor looked up from her extensive notes. These capabilities you're describing, they sound far beyond anything achievable with known technology. How do you explain such apparent impossibilities? Stood and walked to the window, but kept his back to Doctor as he spoke. There are only three possible explanations, Doctor. First, human technology is centuries ahead of galactic civilization, hidden behind elaborate deceptions designed to make them appear primitive. Second, humans possess natural abilities that transcend normal biological limitations, making them functionally supernatural by galactic standards. Third, humans have made contact with extragalactic civilizations that provided them with technologies beyond our current understanding. All three possibilities carried implications that threatened the fundamental assumptions of galactic civilization. If humans possessed advanced technology, every assessment of galactic military balance was obsolete. If humans possessed supernatural abilities, the biological sciences would require complete revision. If humans had extragalactic contacts, the galaxy's isolation was compromised. The evidence supported all three explanations simultaneously, which was impossible according to logical analysis, but undeniable according to observable facts. We were facing an enemy that operated outside the boundaries of everything we thought we understood about reality. The fourth night brought new horrors as human forces began demonstrating capabilities that transcended even their previous impossibilities. Hegemony soldiers reported encounters with human forces that existed in multiple locations simultaneously. Conversations with human personnel who provided information that contradicted the laws of causality, and physical interactions with human equipment that fundamental principles of matter and energy. Reality itself had become unreliable in the presence of human forces, Doctor. Our instruments provided contradictory readings. Our observations couldn't be reconciled with each other. Our basic assumptions about the nature of existence were being systematically invalidated by direct experience with human capabilities. The psychological impact on hegemony forces was catastrophic. Soldiers who had prided themselves on rational thinking and logical analysis found themselves unable to process experiences that contradicted everything they thought they knew. Mental breakdowns became common as individual minds struggled to cope with realities that exceeded their capacity for understanding. Some of my troops began claiming that humans were not a natural species, but artificial constructs created by advanced intelligences for purposes beyond our comprehension. Others believed that humans were natural, but had evolved beyond biological limitations through technologies that operated according to unknown scientific principles. Still, others insisted that humans were entities masquerading as biological organisms. All of these theories were supported by evidence that couldn't be explained through conventional analysis. Human capabilities exceeded biological possibilities while remaining consistent with highly advanced technological applications. Their strategic thinking operated on time scales and complexity levels that suggested either artificial intelligence enhancement or natural cognitive abilities beyond known biological limits. But the most terrifying theory, Doctor, was that humans were exactly what they appeared to be, a natural biological species with normal technological capabilities, who had simply evolved military doctrine to levels of sophistication that made them functionally omnipotent within any combat environment. This possibility was worst because it suggested that human capabilities were reproducible, teachable, and scalable. If humans could achieve such results through normal biological and technological means, other species could potentially develop similar capabilities through proper training and equipment. The implications for galactic military balance were staggering. On the fifth night, the raids stopped, not because human forces had been defeated or driven off, but because they had completed their research program. The base was left intact, personnel were returned unharmed, and human forces simply vanished into the darkness as completely as they had emerged from it. The aftermath was perhaps more demoralizing than the raids themselves. Medical examination of returned personnel revealed evidence of memory implantation, skill enhancement, and psychological modification that demonstrated human medical capabilities far exceeding galactic standards. Equipment examination showed improvements and modifications that represented technological innovations beyond current galactic scientific understanding. The humans had used our own people and equipment as test subjects for capabilities that we couldn't understand, couldn't counter, and couldn't reproduce. They had demonstrated complete mastery over mind, matter, and military organization while providing us with gifts that proved their technological and intellectual superiority. As the session concluded, Doctor realized that account was describing warfare that transcended normal military concepts. The humans weren't just fighting battles. They were redefining the fundamental nature of conflict itself, turning war into a form of accelerated evolution that transformed both aggressor and victim according to human specifications. "Tomorrow," said as the recording device powered down, "I'll tell you about the final phase, Doctor, about how they turned victory itself into a weapon, about how they made us grateful for our own defeat." The room fell silent except for the sound of Doctor gathering her materials and quiet breathing as he stared out at the gardens, seeing not peaceful lawns, but endless darkness filled with human shapes that moved according to rules that reality itself was forced to accommodate. The nightmare was approaching its climax, but the worst revelations were reserved for the end. Doctor found in a different position this morning, standing rigid at attention beside the recording device, as if preparing to deliver a formal military report rather than continue therapy. His forearms were positioned in the ceremonial stance of a hegemony officer providing testimony to superior command, and his compound eyes held a focus that she hadn't seen before. "Today, I testify about the final phase," he announced as she approached. "The phase when we learned that everything we had experienced, the medical facility, the urban warfare, the night raids, was preliminary research, preparation for the real war." He activated the recording device with military precision, then returned to attention. Fleet Marshal received new orders from Hegemony Command on the 10th day after the night raids ended. The orders were classified at the highest level and came with reinforcements that tripled our remaining forces. The mission parameters had changed from pacification to complete planetary sterilization. Doctor felt a chill at the formal tone in his voice. This wasn't the broken veteran who had struggled to speak about his trauma. This was a soldier delivering intelligence that could determine the fate of galactic civilization. The decision to escalate to planetary destruction was made because Hegemony Strategic Command finally understood what we were facing on Terra. The humans had not been defending their world. They had been training their species for galactic expansion. Every engagement, every battle, Every apparent defeat had been calculated to prepare humanity for wars against enemies they had never encountered. The evidence had been accumulating in intelligence reports from across the planet. Human forces were not just improving captured hegemony technology. They were using it as a foundation for innovations that exceeded anything in galactic civilization. Research facilities were producing weapons and equipment that operated according to scientific principles unknown to hegemony science. Training programs were preparing soldiers for combat against species that humans had never met. Reconnaissance revealed that human industrial capacity had increased by over 400% during the period of conflict. Rather than being damaged by our invasion, their civilization had been accelerated by it. They were using war as a catalyst for technological and social evolution at rates that violated every known model of development. The hegemony response was predictable. If humans couldn't be conquered, they would be eliminated. Planetary sterilization protocols were designed to prevent any species from surviving to threaten galactic stability. Orbital bombardment would reduce the planet's surface to molten rock, ensuring that no human knowledge or technology could survive to influence other civilizations. The sterilization fleet consisted of 24 dreadnoughts with full orbital bombardment capabilities. Each ship carried sufficient firepower to glass an entire continent. The operation was scheduled to commence at 600 hours Galactic Standard Time, with complete planetary surface destruction achieved within 12 hours. But the humans had been expecting this escalation. Intelligence reports later revealed that human preparations for planetary sterilization had begun before the first hegemony ship entered their system. They had known, with impossible precision, exactly how the conflict would develop and what the final hegemony response would be. At 5:45 hours, 15 minutes before bombardment was scheduled to begin, human forces broadcast a message on all frequencies. It was not a surrender, not a plea for mercy, not a threat of retaliation. It was an invitation. His formal stance wavered slightly as he recalled the content of that transmission. Greetings to the Hegemony Fleet Command. We appreciate the educational opportunities you have provided during our interaction. In return, we would like to demonstrate some applications of the knowledge we have gained. Please observe. The demonstration began with the systematic neutralization of every weapon system in the Hegemony fleet, not destruction neutralization. Energy weapons simply stopped functioning. Missile systems armed themselves and then disarmed repeatedly. Targeting computers began displaying impossible readings that showed human ships in positions that violated the laws of physics. Within minutes, the most powerful military fleet in galactic history had been reduced to defenseless metal shells floating in space. But the humans hadn't attacked us, Doctor. They had debugged us, like faulty computer programs that needed correction. The human technical capabilities demonstrated during the fleet neutralization exceeded anything that galactic civilization had previously conceived as possible. They had somehow modified hegemony technology remotely, without physical access, without detectable transmission of energy or information. It was as if human consciousness itself had reached across space to reprogram reality according to their preferences. But the neutralization was only the first part of their demonstration. The second part began when human ships appeared in our formation ships that hadn't existed moments before, ships that operated according to design principles that our engineers couldn't analyze or understand. The human vessels were not constructed from any materials known to galactic science. They seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, appearing solid from some angles while remaining translucent from others. They moved without visible propulsion systems, changed configuration without mechanical interfaces, and operated technologies that produced effects without apparent energy sources. These were not the primitive chemical propulsion craft that we had observed during the initial invasion. These were machines that had been built using hybrid human hegemony technology, enhanced with innovations that exceeded both species' previous capabilities. They were proof that humans could not just copy and improve existing technology, they could transcend it entirely. Doctor interrupted for the first time. Are you saying that humans developed faster-than-light technology and advanced materials science in the space of days? That's not technological advancement. That's fundamental violation of everything we know about scientific development. His formal posture dissolved as he turned to face her directly. That's exactly what I'm saying, Doctor, and it gets worse. The humans didn't just develop new technology, they developed new science. They had rewritten the fundamental laws of physics to accommodate capabilities that had previously been impossible. The evidence was undeniable but incomprehensible. Human ships demonstrated gravitational manipulation that created localized alterations in spacetime. They exhibited matter-energy conversion that operated with 100% efficiency. They displayed information processing capabilities that suggested quantum consciousness operating at macroscopic scales. Either humans possessed natural abilities that transcended known biological limitations, or they had made contact with intelligences that provided them with post-technological capabilities. Both possibilities meant that galactic civilization was facing an enemy that operated according to rules that we couldn't understand, couldn't predict, and couldn't counter. The third part of the human demonstration involved the systematic education of the hegemony fleet in the true scope of human capabilities. Rather than destroying the ships, human forces began upgrading them. Hegemony technology was enhanced with improvements that doubled or tripled performance specifications while adding capabilities that hadn't existed in the original designs. They were giving us gifts, Doctor, making our ships better, our weapons more effective, our defenses stronger. But the gifts came with understanding. We could see exactly what they had done to improve our technology, and we could see that their improvements used scientific principles that we couldn't reproduce or even comprehend. The psychological impact on the hegemony fleet was catastrophic. Professional military personnel who had dedicated their lives to understanding technology and tactics found themselves confronted with innovations that exceeded their capacity for analysis. They were being educated by an enemy who demonstrated intellectual superiority so complete that resistance became meaningless. Human forces began broadcasting detailed explanations of their technological innovations, providing complete scientific documentation for capabilities that they had developed during the conflict. They wanted us to understand exactly how they had transcended our technological limitations, wanted us to appreciate the elegance of their solutions. The broadcasts revealed that human scientific advancement during the conflict had been deliberately accelerated through techniques that combined captured hegemony knowledge with human creativity and enhanced intelligence operations. They had compressed centuries of technological development into days through methods that appeared to violate thermodynamic principles regarding information processing and energy conversion. They had not just learned to use our technology, Doctor. They had learned to think like us, and then learned to think better than us. They had absorbed everything we knew about science and engineering, then used it as a foundation for innovations that exceeded our previous understanding of what was possible. The fourth part of the demonstration involved human forces providing complete intelligence assessments of hegemony military capabilities across the entire galaxy. They had somehow gained access to classified information about fleet deployments, technological specifications, strategic planning, and personnel records that should have been impossible to acquire from their isolated position on Terra. Human intelligence operations had penetrated every level of hegemony civilization, from individual soldiers to the highest levels of strategic command. They knew our capabilities better than we knew them ourselves. They had maps of our territory, analyses of our technology, psychological profiles of our leadership, and strategic assessments of our potential responses to any given tactical situation. The scope of human intelligence gathering revealed that their preparations for galactic expansion had been far more extensive than anyone had imagined. They had been studying the entire galaxy, identifying potential allies and enemies, analyzing technological and cultural weaknesses, developing strategies for conflicts that hadn't yet begun. But the most terrifying revelation, Doctor, was that humans had been manipulating galactic politics for decades before our arrival at Terra. They had agents embedded in every major civilization, influencing policy decisions, guiding technological development, shaping cultural evolution according to human strategic objectives. The evidence suggested that human expansion into galactic civilization had begun long before first contact protocols were established. They had been preparing the galaxy for integration into human-dominated civilization through subtle influence operations that affected everything from trade agreements to military doctrine to scientific research priorities. The observation period had not been one-sided surveillance of a primitive species. It had been final preparation for a conquest operation that had been planned for generations and was now ready for implementation. The fifth and final part of the human demonstration involved the presentation of terms for hegemony surrender, not negotiation surrender. The terms were simple, reasonable, and absolutely non-negotiable. Hegemony forces would withdraw from Terran space immediately and permanently. Hegemony civilization would reorganize according to human specifications. Galactic military doctrine would be modified to accommodate human strategic requirements. The surrender terms were not punitive, Doctor. They were generous, compassionate, and designed to benefit every species in galactic civilization. Humans were offering to accelerate the technological and social development of the entire galaxy, to provide innovations that would eliminate scarcity and conflict, to guide galactic civilization toward post-technological prosperity. The terms included detailed plans for technological transfer programs that would provide every galactic species with capabilities equivalent to human achievements, medical advances that would eliminate disease and extend, energy technologies that would make resource scarcity obsolete, transportation systems that would make interstellar travel as convenient as planetary surface movement. But the cost of these benefits was complete submission to human authority. Galactic civilization would continue to exist, but it would exist according to human design, for human purposes, under human management. We would become junior partners in a human-dominated galaxy. Doctor had stopped taking notes, her attention completely focused on testimony. What was the fleet's response to these terms? Return to his formal military posture. Fleet Marshal consulted with Hegemony Command through quantum communication systems that humans had thoughtfully upgraded to operate faster and more reliably than original specifications. The response came within minutes, unconditional acceptance of all human terms. The decision had been inevitable once the scope of human capabilities became clear. Continued resistance would result in complete destruction of hegemony civilization, while acceptance offered the possibility of survival and prosperity under human management. There was no third option. But the humans weren't satisfied with simple surrender, Doctor. They wanted understanding. They wanted us to appreciate not just what they could do, but why they had chosen to do it. They wanted us to become willing participants in galactic transformation rather than sullen subjects of human conquest. The final stage of the human demonstration involved complete transparency about their long-term strategic objectives. They intended to guide galactic civilization toward post-biological existence, transcending the limitations of physical form and achieving consciousness that operated according to principles beyond current understanding. They would eliminate conflict, scarcity, and suffering throughout the galaxy by fundamentally rewriting the nature of existence itself. They weren't conquering the galaxy, Doctor. They were evolving it, upgrading it, transforming it into something better than it had ever been or could ever become without human intervention. And they wanted us to understand that this transformation was a gift, not a punishment. The session was drawing to a close, but Doctor could see that had one more revelation to share. His formal posture remained steady, but something in his expression suggested that the worst was yet to come. There's one more thing, Doctor. One final demonstration that the humans provided before accepting our surrender. He paused, gathering himself for what was clearly the most difficult part of his testimony. They showed us what would have happened if we had refused their terms. They demonstrated exactly what galactic sterilization would look like when performed by a species with post-technological capabilities. It lasted exactly 3.7 seconds and affected 17 inhabited systems simultaneously. The demonstration had been conducted in uninhabited space, but the effects were detectable across the galaxy. Human forces had briefly activated weapons systems that could eliminate all life in multiple star systems faster than information about the attack could travel to other locations. They possessed the capability for instantaneous galactic genocide and had chosen not to use it. They could have eliminated every living thing in the galaxy before any of us knew what was happening, Doctor. But instead, they chose to educate us, to uplift us, to give us the opportunity to become better than we were. They turned victory into mercy and conquest into gift. As the recording device powered down, finally relaxed from his formal posture. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about the return journey, Doctor. about what it's like to live in a galaxy where humans are watching, always ready to help whether we want their help or not. The rehabilitation center suddenly felt very small and very isolated as Doctor considered the implications of what she had heard. If testimony was accurate, galactic civilization had already ended without most species realizing what had happened. They were all living in a human-managed preserve, carefully maintained for their own benefit whether they understood it or not. The final revelation was still to come, but Doctor was beginning to suspect that she already knew what it would be. The final session began differently from all the others. Doctor arrived to find seated normally in his chair, no longer maintaining military posture or formal stances. He looked relaxed for the first time since their sessions had begun, as if a tremendous burden had been lifted from him. The recording device sat between them, but he made no move to activate it. "Before we begin today," he said quietly, "I need you to understand something, Doctor. Everything I have told you over these past sessions, the medical facility, the urban warfare, the night raids, the fleet demonstration, all of it was exactly as I experienced it. But my interpretation of those experiences was incomplete." Doctor felt a chill of apprehension as she settled into her chair. "What do you mean by incomplete?" Reached out and activated the recording device with the same casual gesture he had used on the first day. "I mean that I understood what was happening to us, but I didn't understand why it was happening. I saw the immediate tactical and strategic implications of human capabilities, but I missed the larger picture, the real purpose behind everything they did." He leaned back in his chair, more relaxed than she had ever seen him, but also somehow more alert. "The journey back to hegemony space took 43 days. During that time, I had the opportunity to review all combat recordings, intelligence reports, and technical analyses from the Terra operation. I also had time to speak with other veterans to compare experiences to try to understand what we had witnessed. The return journey had been conducted under human escort, not as prisoners, but as guests. Human ships accompanied the hegemony fleet throughout their withdrawal from Terran space, providing technical support, medical assistance, and educational resources. The humans were helpful, friendly, and completely transparent about their capabilities and intentions. "They wanted us to understand, Doctor, not just what they could do, but what they were trying to accomplish. During the journey, human representatives provided complete explanations of their technology, their social organization, their long-term objectives for galactic civilization. The humans had developed what they called accelerated evolution protocols, systematic methods for guiding civilizations toward post-technological existence. Every species in the galaxy was being carefully monitored and subtly influenced to develop along paths that would eventually lead to transcendence of biological limitations and achievement of consciousness-based existence. The Terra operation wasn't a defensive war, Doctor. It was a graduation ceremony. Humanity had reached the point in their development where they were ready to take active responsibility for galactic evolution. Our invasion provided the perfect opportunity for them to demonstrate their capabilities while transitioning from passive observation to active guidance." Doctor frowned at her notes. "Are you saying that the humans deliberately provoked the hegemony invasion to create an excuse for revealing their true capabilities?" Shook his head. "No, Doctor, the humans didn't provoke anything, but they knew it was coming. They had modeled hegemony psychology so thoroughly that they could predict our responses with mathematical precision. They knew exactly when we would discover their world, exactly how we would interpret the intelligence data, exactly what decisions our leadership would make. The human predictive capabilities extended far beyond simple strategic planning. They had developed what they called consciousness modeling, the ability to simulate the thought processes and decision-making patterns of entire civilizations with complete accuracy. They could predict the behavior of individual leaders, the evolution of cultural trends, the development of technological innovations, the emergence of political movements. They had been preparing for our arrival for over 2 centuries, Doctor, not just militarily, but educationally. Every aspect of the conflict had been designed to provide specific learning experiences for both species. They wanted to teach us about the true potential of conscious intelligence while learning how to guide other species through similar transitions. The evidence was overwhelming once the pattern became clear. Every human innovation during the conflict had been developed years or decades earlier, but held in reserve until the appropriate moment for demonstration. Every tactical surprise had been carefully planned to maximize educational value. Every apparent improvisation had been thoroughly rehearsed in simulation programs that modeled hegemony responses with perfect accuracy. But the most remarkable aspect of human planning, Doctor, was their consideration for our psychological well-being during the transition process. They could have revealed their capabilities instantly, could have forced immediate surrender, could have traumatized us beyond recovery. Instead, they chose to introduce us to post-technological reality gradually, allowing us time to adapt to each revelation before presenting the next one. The gradual revelation process had been designed to minimize psychological damage while maximizing learning opportunities. Each phase of the conflict had built upon previous experiences, creating a logical progression from familiar concepts to impossible realities. The humans had guided hegemony forces through their own evolution from technological to post-technological understanding. They were treating us like students, not enemies. Every engagement was a lesson, every demonstration was an educational opportunity, every apparent defeat was actually a graduation requirement. We weren't being conquered, we were being educated. Doctor looked up from her extensive notes. But the casualties were real, the psychological trauma was real. How do you?